and welcome to the State of Vulnerability Risk Management. A few housekeeping notes before we begin here. A reminder that this session will be recorded and available shortly hereafter. All participants' lines should be muted at this time. In order to ask a question, please type it in the chat box on your screen. And finally, please make sure to use your computer speakers to join the webinar as we're in broadcast audio mode. So thanks for joining us this morning. In today's webinar, our guest speaker, Brian Kime, Security and Risk Senior Analyst for Forrester, will provide perspectives on key market trends shaping the Vulnerability Risk Management, or VRM, market. And my name is Kevin Miller. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager here with Flexera, and I'll be covering how to prioritize vulnerability management and developing effective VRM programs. So with that, I'll pass it over to Brian.
Thank you, Kevin. Again, I'm Brian Kime from Forrester, Senior Analyst on our Security and Risk team. In addition to Vulnerability Risk Management, I cover cyber threat intelligence, digital risk protection, and industrial control system security. So today's agenda, we are going to talk about how there are just too many vulnerabilities for teams to manually patch. We'll also talk about the vulnerability risk management process, and we're also going to talk about threats and vulnerabilities not going away and what you can do about it. All right, not to bore you with a bunch of metrics, you all are very aware of the problem since you are here on this webinar, but a few things that I want to put forth to set the standard for today. So this chart here is from the National Vulnerability Database, showing the number of vulnerabilities over time broken down by severity. And you see over there on the right, the last a very large jump in the number of disclosed vulnerabilities. So far, 2020 data is tracking to be very similar to the last 3 years. So we're kind of entering maybe a new normal of the number of disclosed vulnerabilities. So that does include things that just never get a CVE or are held by some threat that never really gets made public. In addition to just the overall number here, it's important to note that other research shows that the vulnerabilities most likely to be exploited is actually the medium vulnerabilities. That's that large middle section there, the light blue. So meaning that if your vulnerability risk management program is based solely on CVSS scoring, it's very likely that you are going to be patching vulnerabilities that the threats are not actually exploiting. So it's important to have a comprehensive program that prioritizes and patches what actually is getting exploited. So if you're not familiar, every year Forrester conducts a large survey of security and risk leaders to help us and our clients understand the markets and threats. We ask our respondents to identify the various attack vectors used to compromise their organizations. For the past 3 years, our survey has shown that software vulnerabilities are the most observed attack vector used to breach those same organizations. We also ask our security and risk decision makers how many times they estimate their organization's sensitive data was potentially breached. Over half of our respondents in 2019 were breached, but to me, what is really incredible is that almost half of these organizations had sensitive data compromised multiple times in that 1 year period. So clearly we have some systemic issues in our field. You can learn from your own failures, or better to learn from other people's failures. So a few case studies here to go over real quick. CVE 2017-5638, if you don't recall, it's more commonly known as a critical remote code execution vulnerability in Apache Struts. That version of Apache Struts that was vulnerable to this exploit was in use at Equifax, and the patch was made available in early March of 2017, and the information shows that the catastrophic breach at Equifax began a little over 2 months later. So that was about a 67-day window where Equifax could have and absolutely should have applied the patches to their production Apache servers. And we know, of course, that resulted in damage to hundreds of millions of Americans and others around the world. And just last week, 4 members of China's People's Liberation Army were actually indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice for participating in the Equifax breach. Next one, we'll go over CVE 2017-0144, most commonly known as either MS-17010 or Eternal Blue, the NSA code name for that particular capability. So Microsoft released that patch mid-March 2017, and then roughly 2 months later, actors likely operating on behalf of North Korea baked that Eternal Blue capability into WannaCry, and that vulnerable destructive malware kind of went from the east towards the west. And then we know the story of Marcus Hutchins, the UK researcher who broke apart WannaCry, found the kill switch, registered the domain, and basically shut that worm down from then on. But prior to that, hundreds of millions of devices compromised and very significant losses. 6 weeks later, actors likely acting on direction of the Russian government also used the Eternal Blue exploit again to spread destructive malware, targeting a small Ukrainian software company that produces a tax accounting software for Ukrainian businesses and organizations. And unfortunately, the worm was able to spread throughout all the networks, including those of multinational companies. So you're probably familiar with Maersk, the global shipping giant. They suffered many hundreds of millions of dollars in damages because they had to rebuild pretty much their entire network. They got spared just barely by one Active Directory server being temporarily offline in Africa, and they actually had to have humans transfer the hard drive back up to Europe to rebuild their networks, and they suffered millions of losses and lost productivity and client dissatisfaction because they simply could not move stuff. And then the third story here, CVE 2019-0708, the very significant flaw in Windows remote desktop services known as Bluekeep. Patch is available May of last year, and a very large cryptocurrency campaign was observed in November. So despite a very long gap there, still a lot of victims. Stats there over on the right are taken recently from Shodan, and despite Eternal Blue being publicly known and the Microsoft patch being available for almost 3 years, Shodan is still showing over 1,000 servers vulnerable to Eternal Blue. And below that, we see the number of unpatched Windows servers that are vulnerable to Bluekeep, and we're showing over 40,000 there. So clearly we see a lot of organizations that are failing in their vulnerability risk management process. All right, so to have a successful vulnerability risk management process, security and risk professionals, we really need to get closer to IT operations. We need them to help us identify what's out there, and we need to help them with the remediation because we simply don't own the assets. We're there to help IT ops reduce the risk they introduce into our organizations. Not a terrible fan of the term cyber hygiene, but really what it comes down to is a lot of the basics in cyber defense. And then we'll talk also a little bit about using cyber threat intelligence to drive prioritization. All right, refresher of the vulnerability risk management process. Starting in the bottom left is asset identification. Got to know what you have in order to protect it. So that is your on-prem environments, that's your servers, your dev environments, those are your workstations, mobile devices, everything you have in the cloud, your containers and Dockers, and all those sorts of things. Really, you need to know everything out there that your organization is responsible for. And then second step, of course, is the enumeration of vulnerabilities. So that's your scanners going out and your passive and active scanning, your credentialed scans and whatnot to determine with high fidelity what the vulnerabilities are present in your assets. Third step, prioritization. Like we talked about, 17,000 or so vulnerabilities, just unreasonable for any organization to manually patch everything. So we have to prioritize. And then lastly, of course, the remediation is the actual patching of the security patches and getting our systems back into production. So as we kind of hinted at here, the bottom left, your first step, asset identification, and the end of that, remediation, it's really on IT ops. So this really a team sport here. Security and risk pros cannot cover this whole thing together or the whole thing by themselves. It really is a process that really involves your entire organization. So IT ops, as they're bringing in, as they're standing up assets, they really need to work with security to enumerate everything and make the security team aware. Oftentimes we're getting the shadow IT and we're getting certain IT ops or marketing or sales standing up services in the cloud, and everybody needs a better process to get fidelity on all the assets. And then, of course, at the end, IT ops, they own the applications, the servers, the hardware, and it's really incumbent on them to apply the patches and validate that they were successful and put those things back into production. Briefly, let's review the Center for Internet Security's controls, more commonly known as the 20 critical security controls. So if you're unfamiliar with CIS controls, they are 20 prioritized actions, and they offer implementation groups for all sizes of enterprises, from small, medium, and large, for you to benchmark with. The 20 controls are broken down into 3 groups. The basic group, which is very much about knowing your enterprise and your privileged users. The foundational controls are very threat-focused, email and malware defenses, blocking of ports and protocols that don't need to be exposed to the internet. And then lastly, the organizational controls are about process and programs, your security awareness training program, an incident response program, application testing program, and so forth. So within the basic controls, the first 3 are important for a vulnerability risk management program. The first one, inventory and control of hardware assets, and then second, inventory and control of software assets, and then, of course, continuous vulnerability risk management. So if you use the CIS controls as your framework for your defense in-depth strategy, the first 3 controls right there are about 3/4 of the way through a robust vulnerability risk management program. And so what does it all mean? Well, the threats aren't going away. If you go to, say, for example, FireEye, and you look at how they increment their criminal and APT groups by 1 each time. So we're up to like APT, I think they're in the 40s, and the SPIN groups are, I think, somewhere teens, 20s, I forget where. Those numbers just keep increasing. And so we know the threats aren't going to go away. Vulnerabilities, we're in this new normal now of 17,000 or so disclosed vulnerabilities per year. I don't see that changing anytime soon, especially with all of our IoT and the proliferation of devices everywhere. And then consequences, we're seeing some of these breaches really have very incredible financial and operational impacts to the breached organizations. We already touched on WannaCry and NotPetya. If you recall, a year ago, Norsk Hydro, a very large aluminum and metals producer in Norway, was breached an attack with the Ryuk ransomware. And their IT network was so devastated by the Ryuk ransomware that the operators in the industrial processes actually had to disconnect from the IT network and run everything manually, which of course was suboptimal. Production was slower. They failed to deliver for clients as they, of course, they want to, and they suffered, many millions of dollars in damages. In fact, some of their cyber insurance claim, actually most of their cyber insurance claim, has been denied by their insurer. I think they requested somewhere around 60, 70 million in damages, and I think they've only had about 3 million paid out. So cyber insurance is not going to save you in lieu of a good VRM program. All right, so leave you with a little meme here. No brain activity. It's kind of just like hoping and praying that your organization is not targeted. Moving on to inventory, your hardware and software assets. Got a little bit of brain activity there. It's good. You know what you have, and now you can start actually scanning. So continuously enumerating your vulnerabilities. Got some activity going on here. And intelligence-driven prioritization. So knowing what threats may do, and also having your assets tiered, meaning those assets that are most important to your business and your operations, tier 1, and then assets that are less critical are in tiers 2 and 3. So combining that adversary information and your asset tiering will help you prioritize. And then lastly, the galaxy brain of VRM is automated remediation of priority vulnerabilities. We're not quite there yet, but that's a goal I think that is worth striving for. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Kevin, and I'll be back at the end for questions and answers.
Thanks, Brian. And as Brian just spoke about with regard to vulnerability risk management, we hear this from business leaders and IT executives at organizations in every industry. It's what you don't know, and thus what you don't remediate, that will disrupt or severely damage your business. So organizations are aware more than ever that vulnerabilities are a common part of management of their environments, but it takes time and resources to stay on top of it all. And usually that's more than they have. And sometimes that's even when we know there are vulnerabilities out there that are being exploited in the news. As Brian indicated, prioritization and intelligent management are necessary to better detect and respond to these vulnerabilities, with 80 to 95% of risk being reduced by just keeping systems up to date or patched. So that said, without timely vulnerability and threat intelligence, as well as information that prioritizes the process of automation, you're still likely to end up with a highly vulnerable infrastructure, as many of those security breaches come from software vulnerabilities. As we just talked about, more than 30% of enterprise software is past end of life. This is something to keep in mind, as Microsoft just ended lifecycle and support for several of their products this last month, like Windows 7, Server 2008, Exchange Server 2010, and more of those are coming later in 2020, like Office 2010. So this all illustrates that many of the vulnerabilities aren't even addressed, and vulnerability management and cybersecurity are now becoming more of a corporate compliance issue. Those high-profile examples that Brian was walking through, the WannaCry ransomware attack that affected businesses across industries, including names like Honda and Hitachi in 2017, that attack targeted software vulnerabilities in unsupported versions of Microsoft operating systems, vulnerabilities with lower criticality ratings. And the impact of these exploits was major for the affected organizations, as he was just talking about. And while the low criticality ratings were probably overlooked by security teams, it's likely that many were caught just unprepared due to lack of a proactive vulnerability management strategy, lack of visibility into their IT assets, as we were talking about, or adequate project scoping overall. In Flexera's most recent report of Vulnerability Review 2020, our security research team confirmed that the majority of exploits took place in the moderate to less critical levels for their advisories. And this lines up directly with what Brian was stating earlier. Exploits tend to live in the lower ranges where teams are focusing less attention. Proactive vulnerability management strategy that focuses on all software vulnerabilities and criticality ranges is crucial to the success of the overall vulnerability management effort. But the problem with proactive vulnerability management and patching critical software in time is that there's just too much to do. We just saw all those mid to low level criticality scores that were open for exploit on this CUNY data. With new application requests, updating products to assure maintenance for standard functionality or other security updates, security often falls short due to lack of resources. There are 17 to 18,000 new vulnerabilities every year, according to the NVD data that Brian showed. And as we saw in the last slide, our security research team tests and validates those vulnerabilities, with hundreds of thousands of them being excluded as junk or noise each year. But still, that's double-digit thousands of vulnerabilities, and it's overwhelming to our internal teams. So it can take hours or even days to manually package each of these, test and release each update, and all with siloed teams in disparate systems working without key information like criticality scoring or threat intelligence to make intelligent decisions about which ones to address and when. And we see that only 1 in 10 patches are ever typically addressed. So how do you know that those you are patching are the ones that are likely to be exploited? And in many cases, you don't. So give me some good news. Well, you start with risk assessment, which includes asset discovery and classification, something that we've been talking about. Discovery and classification includes scanning until the full software inventory product list is collected and matched then with accurate, curated intelligence, and that delivers direct insights on existing security vulnerabilities and then the known threats to your infrastructure. One of the key advantages here for the defense of your systems is understanding exactly which security flaws affecting your software currently have a known threat. So you want to identify issues that carry immediate risk to your business systems and then remediate those first. This basically reduces the attack surface to a bare minimum, and then when these threats pop up in the news later, it's not a fire drill. This process makes the use of things like threat intelligence, which we know now is a best practice for vulnerability prioritization. So in an example of one of our customers, Northeast Lincolnshire Council, shown here, provides essential services from revenue and benefits to support for local businesses. But limited resources made patching software vulnerabilities across the council's thousands of devices an unnerving challenge for the council's IT security team. They had visibility issues connecting assets and putting these together with security efforts across the entire operation. What they needed was a simple implementation and a singular view of their issues, from the end-of-life applications to where they needed to patch and when. Flexera's vulnerability management solutions delivered seamless integration for them, along with prioritization and automation features that helps the IT security team enhance its vulnerability management. So Flexera's delivery of an unparalleled vulnerability assessment scope provided a comprehensive data to catch all the vulnerabilities affecting their systems directly. The team now has a single comprehensive look at all of these criticalities across all of the council software, which then helped to reallocate some of those resources, the hours and budgeting spent on tracking down remediation efforts. And as we highlighted here, vulnerability management provides visibility to action. You gain awareness of new vulnerabilities as they arise. You bring order to risk overwhelming your IT environment. You intelligently prioritize remediation based on trusted research from industry experts, like in our case, Secunia. You avoid exhausting your resources, find the latest information, and running around playing catch-up. And, of course, the primary goal of keeping your organization safe now and into the future. So as more vulnerabilities are discovered, it's important that the team or teams in charge of patching and remediation manage the process in a systematic and controlled way. Identifying vulnerable products, which also includes those not authorized in an organization's environment, paired with effective automated patch management, is critical to reducing risk windows, which are what we talked about from the time to patch to when you actually patch. And that eliminates the root cause of a potential exposure. The patch management lifecycle that we're seeing here on this page involves 3 key steps. And as you can see here in the chart, they are assess, prioritize, and fix. This includes preparing, so preparation, vulnerability identification, risk assessment, as we were previously mentioning, patch deployment, and then verification, which includes reassessing this after the fact every time. Addressing these keys to the vulnerability management lifecycle strengthens the security of your network. And then you say, Kevin, that all sounds great, but how do I implement a process around this? Well, to add to lifecycle assessment that we were just looking at on the last slide, it's most effective when you have a plan for attacking security risk. So the 4 items here in the funnel show how to make better decisions with your data. With a key partner like Flexera, rounding out your data, focusing on threat scores, criticality ratings, sensitivity of your assets to the organization, and the prevalence will help determine an effective course of action. So focusing on security updates and patching based on those being exploited most, then further down to those that would cause the most damage, followed by those that would affect the most sensitive assets that you have, financial, et cetera. And finally, those applications with the widest range, the ones that are installed for all of the users or the most users on the most hardware. This is a simple but effective process, and it can help your organization position itself against the onslaught of vulnerabilities that we've seen required to be managed. So in another example from a current Flexera customer, the Tucson Electric Power Company found it virtually impossible to meet stringent compliance standards that were required for a utility. And TEP needed to upgrade and automate an inefficient manual vulnerability management process. And the utility that they chose, Flexera's security research, the team responsible for our software vulnerability research, for an integrated solution that delivered centralized, automated oversight and provided a more efficient process for managing security risk. The IT team at TEP implemented the new process and were able to develop efficient, centralized management. The utility's manual processes for compiling notification and assessment have now been automated, which has enabled them to easily meet NERC requirements to address all vulnerabilities and patches within 30 days of their release. So back to that window, getting them within the window. And what are the benefits of vulnerability management? Well, we talked a little bit before about what those key benefits were, and now it's taking these steps and knowing that the threats to your environment and how to secure them offers more than just peace of mind. It saves money and time that you could be better applying within the organization. So develop a complete picture of your environment and understand where your issues are, and then prioritize intelligently using the processes and intelligence we just talked about today. You can remediate faster and avoid all the chaos of a vulnerable environment by partnering up for your vulnerability information. Flexera assesses the most vulnerabilities and offers the most patches of industry providers, and resources spent searching for criticality information can be better spent making strategic business decisions for your organization. So know that threats are kept at bay with the most up-to-date vulnerability information and actionable intelligence. So with that, I want to say thank you. We appreciate your time jumping on with us today, and I want to open it up for questions. So our first question here that I got is, you mentioned that Security Research vets NVD, which is the National Vulnerability Database, data. How does that work? Well, in a nutshell, our security research team tests and validates vulnerabilities from the NVD. In the process, they rescore each of them, issue rejections for non-viable vulnerabilities, and then they exclude junk and noise that's out there. In many cases, that junk and noise is just information that's not related, not vulnerability related. And with the NVD, many sources can submit, and not all of them are credible. So this is an ongoing process with Secunia that ensures that our advisories contain the most accurate details and impact rating, are continuously updated with additional details, available fixes, and assigned CVEs, and are not duplicates of existing advisories. They don't describe fake vulnerability reports, and they don't incorrectly list multiple attack vectors to the same vulnerability as different vulnerabilities. Then another question that we've got here is a good one. Does Flexera integrate with WSUS or Config Manager for patching? So that's SCCM. And we do. You can patch create and publish packages and set automated data imports with WSUS for Config Manager. It centralizes patch management and in the process for Microsoft updates and third-party software into a single admin interface at the CCM admin console. So you can assess all software for vulnerabilities directly from the interface and see missing security patches in the patches menu. You can also create and publish them using like a static prioritization metric and threat scores. Basically, it's maximum efficiency with minimum effort. And here's another one. This one might be good for you, Brian. We use a vulnerability scanner. Will that keep my environment secure?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, only using a scanner, only gets you so far. We talked about the vulnerability risk management process. First step is asset identification. So running a scanner against your environment without having any kind of inventory, you're definitely not going to get 100% enumeration of all your outstanding vulnerabilities. So you really need to back up and get that asset inventory before you scan. Also, you really need to have a good understanding of where your assets are in cloud environments as well. That's pretty tricky to do. So you really have to work with your IT ops teams and anybody else that's building any applications in a cloud environment.
Great, thanks, Brian. And then I would also add to that, scanners report, on an individual basis, so they usually can't aggregate. And that means that security and operations, for example, won't be able to collaborate by seeing all those criticalities that might affect, most systems or have the biggest overall impact to the org. So all that kind of mitigates their effectiveness, which is why you would want, to build on that, as Brian was saying. And then I'll go through two more here. We have one for Brian. What does Forrester mean by using cyber threat intelligence to prioritize vulnerability management?
Yeah, so I see cyber threat intelligence really as a risk management function. Of course, we're talking about vulnerability risk management here, so they definitely go hand in hand. And so your CTI team, your vendors, whatever capability you have that can do some cyber threat intelligence, should be out there assessing threats, intent, and capabilities. So intent is, what are they trying to do? Are they trying to steal money? Do they want to ransom your data for money? Are they trying to create some kind of impact on an industrial system? And then on the capability side, a vulnerability exploit is one of those capabilities that a threat may use against you. So your CTI capability should be assessing those threats and on what they can do impact capability-wise, and then telling your asset owners and your vulnerability management team that these are the types of exploits that our threats, the threats most likely to target us, are going to be exploiting. So if you are, if you're running Oracle PeopleSoft, there's been a lot of threats out there that are exploiting vulnerabilities in PeopleSoft to install like cryptocurrency. And then if you have certain types of, maybe industrial processes, your utility or a manufacturer, that's a different type of landscape out there. So a good prioritization of vulnerabilities will be based on what threats your particular organization is most likely to see.
Thanks, Brian. And we'll take one more. And this one is, you talked a bit about patching our patch catalogs enough to secure my environment. And that's a great question. I think it's really similar to scanners. They're basically a half measure. Patch catalogs are exactly a catalog of patches, and they don't help you assess your environment or help you decide how to prioritize. A lot of the stuff that Brian's talking about as well, they're limited, and they put a lot of the pressure on the security and ops teams to determine how and when to deploy all that. So there isn't enough context to make a sound decision for the business. And with vulnerability management, like what Flexera we've been talking about here, you're pulling intelligence into the industry, or from the industry renowned teams like Secunia, and that helps you understand where and when and how. Get access to more patches, patch details, and the most patches available. So you're not just buying a set of patches, you're buying what's basically out there. So something to think about when you're thinking about patch catalogs is that it's really just buying a catalog rather than being able to apply with any kind of intelligence. And with that, I want to say thanks again for joining Brian and I today. We hope you found this session informative and feel better prepped to take on the chaotic vulnerability risk management landscape with some of our tips. And thank you, Brian, for joining us as well. You guys all have a great day.